Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be kind of the wrap-up session for the other session, which was seeing the major Russian rout here on the southern edge of the board. We have, if I give you car sickness for a moment, we had quite a few units that were in huge disarray. This Russian division they were broke and they retired. But this was the big one that we spent some time last week talking about what we could do with them, and it's not pretty. So we were pretty much determined that they're out of the game. We're going to play it out and use the rules to try and bring them back to the board, but they will not be coming back with like their 15 units. They're going to be coming back much smaller, but we're going to see if we can make that work. The problem is we have a lot of fresh, ready to go French. So this is intermingled here. We've got some remaining Russians, but they're not holding out very well either. We've got, well, I say fresh, but they're pretty fresh compared to the Russians. And in addition to that, he still has a formation of French in the city that haven't done anything in the village, and he still has a whole other division. So a lot of what we talked about last week at the end of the game is, what options do the Russians have? And there's not many. How many turns did we get into?
We are going into turn 6.
Out of 12?
It's a 16
16
game.
16 turn. Turn 6, and we pretty much saw I don't know what you call it, when you dissolve.
Decimation? I don't know.
Well, that's probably better than saying dissolving. Dissolution, but yeah, the decimation of Russian forces. Maybe dice will change, but I don't think so. Yeah, so we're at the top of that turn. So anyway, this was just a brief recap of where we were from last week, and then I think we'll hop into starting some of our turn actions and come back when there's anything real important that we want to share combat-wise or something like that. Yeah, did you have anything you want to add?
Not at the moment.
Good. All right. We'll be back in a few minutes. And what we're going to do here is take a moment to talk about how we're going to fix this broken Russian formation. And this is something that we spent quite a bit of time talking about, how to make this work, because it's going to take several things to happen. And a lot of that's going to be through the leader actions. So we're on the next turn. We've done activate order, we did issue orders, now we're on to leader actions. Tom has done his leader actions, so we're going to do some here for the Russians. And the first thing they're going to do is try to bring back this division. I mean, they could also try to rally their artillery, but I think they're going to try and do this Russian formation first, because there's a lot of fatigue here that will prevent just about anything from happening. So what are we looking at? Well, right now this unit has 15 fatigue, and it's got 12 infantry with it. And the artillery doesn't count towards deployed units or anything like that. So we got to bring down this fatigue quite a bit. So we were thinking, first thing would be to take personal command. So we've got the formation leader who would, oh no, it's got to be my guy. I got to find my guy on the table.
You're the man.
That's right, I'm the man, not the formation guy. So I think this was me back here.
Your name today is Revesky,
That's
or
right.
however that's pronounced.
I'm going with Revesky. That sounds good. Revsky. So I brought down Revsky here. That's the guy we're attaching. So I take personal command. So that's the first thing. That's a free action. So some of the things that we're looking at are what I call free actions. They don't require a dice roll. They just occur. And that one happens for free. But for him, the other thing we got to do is also change their status from broken to the R&R. Now, if you're following along in your books, we were on page 12.
Yep.
So I'm not going to pause and read. I'm just going to try to not give you too much motion sickness here. But we're going from broken status, so we're going to take them to the rally and reform status. And right about there. So that one can be given to a formation by an army or force commander who has taken personal command. So that was the first thing that we did. The rallying reform status may be given to any formation in this way and replaces a formation's current active order status. The rallying reform status allows the Inspire formation leader action and has some penalty or same penalties as the broken status if the formation performs an assessment. All right, well that's very devastating. So we made a temporary token here. I had one that was broke, so I could just flip it. That's already got something. So I'm just going to put a generic token and just write an R and R on it for completeness sake. Now, what it means here by the Inspire, if we go back, I think that's on the previous page.
It's on 14.
14, all right. Not previous, but next. Inspire, right down here. Let me shift the camera again. All right, so in a nutshell, what this does is allows me to dismiss a unit from the formation, and that gives me back 2 fatigue. And again, no test is required for that, so that would be another one of those freebies. So the thing is, in order to come out of the rest and reform, at some point, you have to convert these folks to like a defend, which would be, I think, a test later on. But in order to do that, I have to get rid of enough fatigue to make a roll possible. Because every point of fatigue against your leader check, leader action, each point of fatigue is like a minus against you. So like right now, if I tried to roll to maybe convert these folks to a defend, there's no way I could get them to a defend because minus 15.
So what you're trying to do, there's going to be an order conversion step that comes up as the first thing in the movement.
Yep.
And then during an order conversion step of movement or the combat phase, a formation that has less fatigue than its number of deployed units may remove its status, which would be rally and reform, and default to a active defend
good.
directive.
That's what we want. So that's the goal, is to get enough fatigue off. So basically, with 15 points of fatigue, we were talking about like how many units I would have to get rid of. Because if I got rid of 2 units, let's see, I got a little spare paper here. So if I get rid of 2 units, that's 4 fatigue, and then that would leave me with 11 fatigue, and then I would have 10. So if I drop 3 units, that would be 6 gone. And then I would have 9, but then I'd have 9 units. So I'd put me at the break even.
Well, you have, at this point, you have no deployed units. So what you're trying to do is consolidate and remove enough fatigue that will give you the ability to successfully make a, what do they call that? Again, not Inspire, but you're trying to get to a point where you can successfully make a rally roll, where you don't have so many negatives by fatigue impacting your roll that you can't possibly make the rally roll.
And that's what I'm figuring. So right now, if I get rid of 4 units, that would let me bleed off 8 fatigue. I would have 9 left. Because 15 minus or 7. And then I would have, but if I dropped 4 units, I would have, so really at this point it doesn't matter how many units I have left over because there's nothing currently deployed. They're still broke. So I have to get rid of the penalty. I'm going to have to drop more than 4. And this is what we were talking about last time. So if I drop like half of them, I think if I drop 6, I think we said we would have to drop almost 7 units, I think.
So if you got rid of 6,
that's 12. I have a penalty of 3.
3 left.
Yeah.
And then you got a B leader going to a B leader or +4s.
That's a +4.
And you're way back there, so it's not like closeness to enemy is doing anything. So now you're at the point where you might be able to make some rolls because you're
with 6. 7 was going to give like a +3, I think, overall. Well, yeah, because we'd have fewer fatigue. It wouldn't be a plus, it would just be less fatigue to deal with. And then we would have good bonuses from the 2 leaders. But I think if we go with 6, if I drop 6 units,
then you're down to 3 fatigue.
and then by 2 leaders talking to each other is
Yeah.
4, so that'd be
So
a plus 1 on the
+1,
roll.
and then you're going to have to make the rally rolls.
For
You would still have the 3 fatigue left.
yeah,
So you would have to make 3 successful rally. Well, you'd have to make 4 actually, because at 100%,
and
3
plus
to 3, there's still
plus
a
1
retreat
is still
status.
pretty. Yeah, I mean, and just because you got plus 1, and you need a 7 to successfully do it, and a
Right.
plus 1 is not a huge boon. I think that's why we were thinking 7, because that would have got rid of, like, there would have been 1 point of fatigue. That would be a lot more mad, because then I have like a plus 3 on the roll.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's what we came to as I was
And
going through this.
When you're talking that way, you're talking about you started with 12 infantry units and you pair off 7, then you have 5 left, and then you start making rolls to get however many,
Mhm.
you know, you got to get 2 rolls, I guess.
Get 2 out,
Because
yeah.
that would be,
'Cause
you
then-
know, over the
The threshold,
threshold
of fatigue
of-
versus
for retreat.
So 7, I think, is what we went with, and I'll probably have to do that. So that basically that really cuts that down from a very large formation down to something more manageable. And just as a side, not in the rules, but just one of the things I think about is reading in some forums. I've read that folks have said, well, the game is just too abstract in some things. Like, what exactly is the reason why they have to get rid of those folks? And abstractly, if you play narratively, you could say, well, 1, it's because those are the wounded. You're not going to bring the wounded with you. Maybe their supply lines have been hurt in some capacity, so they don't quite have the beans and bullets. So basically what you're doing is you're just scraping together the few good working soldiers, equipment, bullets that you have, and sending that back forward. Because when they broke, and you figure they ran from the front, they probably left behind quite a few things that normally they would have brought forward with them. So what you're doing at this point, when you're doing that inspire, is exactly what you're doing. You're trying to inspire the few remaining people that you have to move forward. And in this situation, in order to inspire the few remaining people I have, he could only bring with him 5. He got enough. 5 units is what we decided he can bring forward with him. So when you think of the inspire, it's not, don't think of it as inspiring people to leave. It's what you're doing is you're figuring out how many people you can inspire to return to battle with you, and the rest decided to take off. And that's kind of where I'm at here. So I think that's what I'll do. I'm going to take 7 of these away. So just to give you kind of a quick in perspective, so that means each one of these little blocks here, that's a unit. So like they'll be gone, they'll be gone, they'll be gone. But I'm going to keep the Jaegers.
You might want to keep those.
I am keeping the Jaegers.
The most effective units you have.
So if I keep these Jaeger, I'm going to drop 1 of him, and we're going to keep all the Jaeger units intact. So I'm going to bring them up to the front here. So we're going to keep the 2 sets of Jaegers, 1 line guy. Now I had over here the sapper unit, but he's like a specialty unit. But he was part of this formation.
Still okay. He doesn't have to go in.
I think
fine.
he's somewhere.
Send the reformation.
And there's so that's what we're going to be left with. So we're going to go ahead and get rid of 7, and we're going to keep the elite of the elite. So we're keeping the Jaegers and one line unit, and the rest of these, my army command. But see, now that we've done that, though, that is the free actions. What I could do is I could detach the force commander. Right now, the force commander really isn't needed anywhere else. So I'm going to leave him attached, because now the next turn when we do, well, I guess I could do the leader actions now. Those were the free leader actions. Now that he's attached and take personal command, I think there's a bonus for that too. Yeah. No, there might not be. I thought there was if he was attached. That's just if he's changing his own objective and whatnot.
Well,
but he does get to use his leadership rating, which is, they're all Bs. I thought maybe he was an A, but no, they're all Bs. So it's a B to a B anyway. It's all Bs. So no big.
I think he does kind of assist you.
I thought so.
Because you're going to get your issuers +2 for being a B.
Yeah.
Then your
Personally
issuer
commanding.
is taking personal
That's right.
command.
I was looking for that line. There it
and
is.
then the receiving guy is still there helping you.
This is the line that I was looking for and couldn't see right in front of me, but that's it there. So he's going to get his +2. Issuer is personally commanding. That's the part that I was overlooking, but he'll add his +2 again. Actually, you know what I could do? I probably could go with just leaving out 6.
Maybe so.
You know what? I'm gonna do that. That way I can have. Yeah, we're gonna do that. I'm just gonna drop off 6 of these guys instead of 7.
So you'll have 3 fatigue left.
So we'll have 3 fatigue. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Now see, for future, that was another consideration too. Is in the future, they still have 3 fatigue. Their only saving grace was if I can get them converted to a defend, then depending on how quickly the French push, they could, in a defensive stance, burn off fatigue. Ooh, that's a risk though, because the French are like really, really pushing towards the back. And these guys, since they're in that rest and reform, they always have to maintain like the 24,
900 yards.
Yeah, 900 yards. So they will continually be pushing back. They'll never have a chance to just stay put necessarily, and
They might have a.
they might.
They might have a turn or two because
There might be. It's really hard to
I
decide.
reached my objective, which the Russians don't necessarily know that in reality, but I have, so they converted to a defend,
I better
which
take it
then
off.
means I have to say, okay, keep pushing them, guys. I'll
Yeah.
let you back on a move or
I'll tell
an
you what.
attack.
Last time I gambled, I lost horribly when I did the rapid deployment and gave them that 1 point of fatigue. It all went downhill from there. So even 1 point of fatigue can change the tide of a battle. So looking at that 1 unit going, yeah, it's just 1 unit, but that would still give me 5 units to fight with. And he made little formations of 5 French. And those 3 groupings of 5 French, I mean, they decimated. So we're gonna go ahead and stick with the original plan. So we'll have 1 fatigue. All right. So I'm making notes on my paper here. So I'm gonna have 1 fatigue. Now I can start rolling to see if we can rally up some guys. All right.
All right. So maybe this is where you do a cut real quick.
Would we do a cut? Should we do a cut?
Yeah. Don't stop, and we can come back to
All
say.
right, we'll come back. Yeah, sure, because we already talked a little bit about it.
Let's talk out that. Now you have 1 fatigue.
All right, yeah, so we took a moment just to talk it out, and I think we've got this settled just fine, because I'm going to issue the order, that's +2, I'm attached, that's another +2, and then the person receiving it is a +2. So that right there in all the glare adds up to 6. Then 1 point of fatigue. So I'm going to have a +5 to the roll. Like, I can't fail. I'll be able to rally everything. Then again, it goes back to where, okay, how important is that 7th unit? That would change the dynamics a little bit. I would have to roll, but ultimately, again, though, this is like guaranteed. I can bring everything out, no dice rolls required, because even if I roll snake eyes, 2 + 5 is a 7. Everything's going to pop out. And they'll automatically go to defend, and so even if he doesn't push through immediately, there's a chance that by the time I decide to move forward again with this division, they'll have no fatigue. Whereas if I kept that other unit, they would be trying to burn off 3 fatigue, and the French might be there before they fully burnt that off. So this, I think ultimately this is the better decision. We'll lose more men in the long run here, or in the short term, but I think in the long run, this puts us in a better fighting position. So that's what we're going to do. And so I'll lose out on, I'm shifting some folks off camera you can't see. So we're going to have these 5 folks, and my leader is still attached. So at this point, though, they would be in the defend. I could also rally the artillery.
They all go back. You'll rally them in the
even the artillery I had lost.
Area now.
Well,
the reserve.
Yeah, they'll be in the reserve. I think,
area.
and these guys will be, well, since they rally back to the front.
they'll rallying right where they are. They're not
Well-
going anywhere. They're
well, yeah, they
going
would just
to a defend
rally.
order.
Yeah, I guess there was no front for them to go back to, so
Yeah,
they'll just
everybody
convert
else,
here.
they're back.
So their reformation area shifts from where, because they're now a full unit, but they're,
When they broke,
see this,
they went back 24 inches.
they went back off the table
and so they broke from there to
approximately,
somewhere back there. That's where they ran to.
and that's where they broke. So if we rallied them,
So
yeah,
there's
we
our
had set 'em up
temporary
here. That's their
rallying
new
reform.
reformation area.
Your artillery pieces, which you don't have to roll for anymore either,
Yep, 'cause
because
they're
they'll
out
be
now.
success, they are going to be in the artillery reserve behind your rallied units, which at the first order conversion are going to go from rally and reform
To defend.
defend.
But they're going to stay put.
On fatigue.
Because I keep thinking they're going to push back, but go because it says when they rally they go back, but there's no leading elements or trailing element. There's nothing for them to go back to.
No, that
so
whole
they're
formation broke.
They're
Yeah.
back here, the 24 inches. Yeah, so that's how you bring back a completely ravaged formation of like 12 infantry units. Is you're just going to have to kick some of them out, keep a few. So I'm going to leave them here off to the side instead of trying to transfer over to the back of the table. And then these folks, I'll just kind of slide over to the side. I'll keep
And
the
your
artillery.
go right behind your
So the
units,
artillery are
they're in
just
the
right back here.
reclamation area.
So we'll just bring them over, and then one more with the shaky cam, and then I think we'll be good for that. So this is ish. Now this leader is still attached. At that point though, I could go ahead and make a roll to detach him in case he needs to do something else, because he does not need to be attached anymore. And that would be a roll. And he doesn't have fatigue or anything like that. It would just be him, and he's the receiver. So he's the issuer and the receiver. That's a +4. And he's not in range to any enemies, anything like that. So I believe it's just he'd be a +4 on his roll.
I think you're going and you're telling, I think you get the +2 of the other guy, because you're handing it off to him. You're
Okay.
saying, hey, I'm done here. Have you got it? You understand? And
All right.
he's
I'll go
got
with
some
that.
skill set of his own, and he's going to say, yeah, I got it. Move on. What's going to be important, and this is
Let me check
getting
that.
back to the movement
Because
kind
we don't
of thing.
detach all that often. Let me set the camera down, and they can just look at the pretty miniatures close up. Let me look at that detach real quick and see if it's just him or if he does get everything. Because I thought we had played it before where it was just him to himself.
I did, and I think I read something just this past week where that
Okay.
question came up, and David said, "Yeah, you're handing it off to that other guy.
Oh,
He's still
that works.
there,
That works then.
and you would get that." But here's the thing: he's going to be back. He's right here, about right here, right?
Right.
24 inches back.
Okay.
When he detaches, and I'm assuming he'll do it successfully because he can't fail, he gets to move half his full distance. Because he moved from here to here to begin with, and then
Right.
when he detach, he gets to move half. But he also has to pay, because David put this out there last week, he's paying for terrain.
Mm-hmm.
So now he's got half his full distance, and he's probably half of that. So he's going to get back somewhere in here. But he can't get too far, because he's going from here, whatever half his distance is,
Right, we'll look.
normally, because he's detached, that's all he gets. Then he pays for terrain, which is 2-to-1, I think.
Yeah,
That's
normally
terrain.
they are, it says, well, ployed off-road or poor road. So 36 inches, I think that says in your scale. So half of that, he can still move like 18.
Yeah. So he can move 18 from here, but he's going to pay for all this terrain. So he could probably move about 9.
Well, that's what I'm saying. No, that's what I'm saying. Half of that. 36 is his full ployed. 36, and then half if you do the
Well,
terrain.
And it's not. He's not getting half because of the terrain. He's getting half because when he detaches, it tells you
Oh, he
that
gets
you'll
half.
get
Oh, okay.
half
Yeah,
of your
so that
move to
would
go
be
back.
so 9 inches then.
So you'll get about 9, and so you'll go.
I'd still be
from
off the table.
Here to, I don't know, somewhere around.
I'll put him on the table edge just because I
Here.
don't have an invisible table to
Yeah,
hold
we
him
don't.
up.
Yeah.
So
plop right
But you might say, well, why would he want to go back? Well, only because he's got a whole other division right here
and
to
he
support.
probably wants to
So-
be within 24 inches of his other leader, so he
Because
doesn't take any.
Because he might
names.
need to be there next, because that's where the fighting is taking place now, which isn't going so good for them either. I said I wouldn't do any more of the shaky camera here, but it's easy to pull stuff around. They're going to need his leadership here in a little bit, because see, they've got 9 fatigue on them, so this blue unit is hurting, and I probably would attach. Well, even if he attaches, that won't affect.
I don't think it's gonna.
Yeah, because his
You've got
tactical
it.
rating is a 0, so him attaching wouldn't do anything. Oh no, his tactical rating is 2.
Right. But I don't think he can't get there to attach.
No,
anyway.
not anytime soon.
So it'll be next turn
But
before if he.
you know,
wanted
it's
to
like
get
one of those
into
things.
that.
If they survive, he might want to attach. Yeah, well, what a rough. Okay, so I think that pretty much does for him. Oh, I got it. Okay, so we're saying that he gives the order, he's there, and he's handing the reins off. So that guy, his rating counts because it's his understanding of the command. Okay, I'll go with that. That's fine. So he automatically detaches. Cool.
And he winds up somewhere
And
close to
he's-
the back edge of that table.
He's close to the back edge. I'm going to try not to hit it with my belly. So we're going to say he's there. Yeah, that was quite a bit.
There's all your leader actions.
That's all leader actions.
Unless you got something else.
No.
Well, I don't think there's anything else.
Nope, I think that will do it. So what we're going to do, and Tom had this as an idea, since we've already played several turns of games that you've seen, just all the basics moving and all that stuff, we'll probably still come back to show the shooting and aftermath of things, but if we're going to do major things like this, trying to figure out how to bring them back, or the big stuff, we'll bring the camera back to show you the big important stuff, but we'll probably let a lot of the basic stuff go by, because you've already seen that a bunch of times. So that's what we'll do. I'm going to put the camera down and we'll push our way to the next important thing. Alright, so this next part isn't super important, but it is something to consider. So right now, this Russian division is fractured. I've got some units that have not actually participated in combat yet, so they're still up on this original front line I had. These folks suffered losses and had pushbacks, so they're fractured. So what I was talking with Tom is like, how do I dress the line? I don't think they could really feasibly move forward to fix the line, because you can't really move towards people unless you're doing like your counter charge or something like that. And I didn't think that shifting on a defend would make sense, that they would just shift towards the enemy to try and dress their lines up with their buddies here. So when talking with Tom, we said, well, what would make sense narratively is these guys are probably going to draw back. They could fall back because, again, the bulk of the unit is now here and they're on a defend, and since you can shift things to try and like dress your lines, we thought it would make sense then that they went ahead and they're going to fall back to this new area, since this will be kind of the new hub base of their formation. So that's what we're doing there. And I just wanted to point that out because I think that one kind of shows the flexibility of the rule set in allowing things like that, using terms like shift. It isn't very specifically saying that you can only do this or that. I think again, it kind of goes back to, are you talking the spirit of the rules or the rules as they're written in the black and white? And I think this is kind of a pretty good example of like the spirit, like what would make sense narratively. Well, they're going to dress their lines, but they can't really push forward. They're going to go ahead and fall back and dress their lines. And that's what we're going with. And that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to put the camera down so we can do that.
Got 20 inches that I can use. No, I'm deployed. I got 15 inches that I can use, but it's 2 for 1 when I hit
So
this.
about 7.5 inches.
So if I go from here to here, that's going to cost me 10. And
There's a little bit of open there.
11, 12.
Now he's out of the rough.
That'd be 13,
I'll give you
14, and he's going to
back in the woods.
stop right about, that's about as far as he can go, crossing that rough. And then he's in kind of rough all the way here. Oh. That's going to get me 6. That's going to get me 8. That's going to get me 10. A little fraction of them's on the the backside, call that 12, 13, 14, 15. He stops. Everybody else should be some
Closely behind.
lined up behind. You know, this guy might be right alongside of him. Say about there. And everybody else is probably right about like that. So that moves them up. They got to objective, so they converted to a defend. He's sitting on the south side of the ridge, which is my objective. They're on defend. What to do, what to do. They're going to say, we're a bit tired from that fight last turn. Let's see what happens, and we'll give some time for the other brigade to catch up.
Nice. So again, nothing important. I just wanted to show after the movement. This is pretty much after the movement. This is how the Russians reformed. So they made two solid lines, but they fell back to do it though. So they're no longer pushed forward, and that did leave some ground for the French to come up. But again, a lot of the map is rough terrain on the south side, so they're moving at half. So this is what essentially the new French line looks like, and it's broken into the three formations that he made from his original large French unit, and now we've got the Russians consolidated so they can receive the French coming up. And he was just measuring, so there's going to be within 6.
I got units still on a move.
So
that are on the road coming up, and so
they might have to stop at some point because there's a certain distance he has to stop because
the cavalry did convert because they got within 12 last turn. They converted to a defend.
I forgot he had like one small formation.
Small cavalry unit. So I mean, I really, once movement's done, I got to try to deploy or deploy. Now I've got this unit coming up who is still on a move, and the objective is over here. So I'm really getting to, well, they have to pay for some terrain too. Yeah. They're going to get right about here. That's going to use up about 13 inches of their move, and then it's going to get a bit slow, but that gets them to within 12 anyway. So essentially, the head of that column is going to get right about there. He'll be in the swamp.
Yeah, and then it comes back to the great old that we've discussed a few times is how do you deploy and put all these folks when there's already people in the space you want them to be? So that'll be the things Tom works on next. And then we'll go ahead and pause the camera there and we'll come back for something else. All right, thought we'd bring this back to share. We just finished the movement and we were going to take a look at skirmish and artillery phase. Not to go over the steps, but to go over the conundrum of this Russian division and how it compares to the other Russian division we just brought back. So when you're looking at your different modifiers, the one that is important now for this group is the per infantry fatigue marker, the glare here. It's -3 on your overall modifiers, okay? This particular division where we're going to do some skirmish for has 9 fatigue. That would be 9 times 3 minus 27 as far as modifiers go. And you have to have a 10 to at least invoke one status assessment. And even if I rolled 12, and maybe I had a couple other modifiers like +1 because it's Jaeger, so that's like a +3. I mean, I'm still looking at like a huge deficit of penalties because that's even if I rolled boxcars. So effectively, this Russian unit is not, even though they've dressed their lines, they're not effectively firing yet. And this is one of those considerations we were thinking about with that original unit we were bringing back, why we needed to get the fatigue off, because even if I left with 3 fatigue and successfully rallied them and brought them out, that would be -9 to their gunnery. But with these folks being up there at the front, they're on to defend, but because they're within range, they're never going to bleed off any fatigue from resting. So they're going to be available for combat, but here's the problem. Just more thoughts. Is one, since I can't skirmish effectively, we'll do the math. Maybe there's a chance, but because I've got a few frontline Jaeger units there that maybe, but that's a huge deficit to overcome on -27. So the thought that I was having was, is that realistic? Because I know some people, they look at mechanics of a game before they want to jump in for themselves. And I was thinking to myself, that might be a deal breaker for folks if they're wondering about the effects of fatigue. And this right here is a huge effect of fatigue. It's a lot of fatigue for sure, but it's kind of made that unit almost combat ineffective. They probably on their own would want to fall back, but that would be future discussions on what to do with them. So right now, they're pretty much just absorbing bullets. See, that was where my mind was going next, is, well, what can I do with them? If they can't return volley fire, and they're not close enough to invoke combat because they're not touching, if they just stay there, they're just continuing to absorb and get fatigue, which will break them at some point. What do I do with them for future turns? So that'll be a discussion for later that we have off camera, but we just wanted to point that out. Is if you wanted to know the devastating effects of fatigue, this is a really good example. 9 fatigue, -3 just on that one line, plus any other penalties you have. That means that's a whole lot of hole they have to dig themselves out of in order to even try to force some kind of assessment on the French. All right, we'll come back later.
All right, in discussing the Russian formation's current situation with the 9 fatigue points, and kind of given some illustrations on why that much fatigue has currently made them somewhat ineffective in the skirmish and artillery phase. Skirmishers are representing your light companies, or who knows, even maybe your grenadier companies, or from the Jaeger perspective, all their companies are capable of skirmishing. And they would be out in front of the lines engaging their French counterparts in skirmish fire. That fatigue that they've taken represents a multitude of things, and one of those is a loss of cohesion within the unit, an actual loss of individuals who may be dead or wounded, or a loss of individuals who just absented themselves from the front line to help that wounded comrade back to the medical facilities, but they're not up there on the front line now. And so essentially this unit has to take the remaining individuals left available to them, the manpower, and fill in those lines. They don't have the power anymore to detach that light company to do that skirmishing. They're right in the main line now. They've got to cover the losses that fatigue represents. Now, you can gain back fatigue, right? So at some point, the guys, or the 2 guys, or the 10 guys who carried Boris back to the medical tent, some NCO or officer back there was going to say, wait a minute, your unit's up there. We got Boris. Get your backsides back up to the front line and get back in that fight. And you do that in game mechanics by recovering fatigue, and those guys come back. So at some point they may come back. At the moment, they're just not there to help this formation be effective in skirmish fire.
And I love that explanation. That helps me because being the narrative type of visual person I am, I don't always grasp the mechanics, but narratively that makes sense. And it also makes sense, again, because there's no individual basis for skirmishers. But I have seen that in other games where you actually could take part of your unit, move them forward and call that your skirmisher, and then recall them as needed. So I think that helps me visualize that explanation of why the fatigue actually plays that big of a factor. They've called back the skirmishers to fill the gaps. That makes sense to me. And that's what the skirmishing represents. So really the skirmishing part isn't necessarily all of these guys firing, but it might be the skirmishers they've contributed to the fielding out front. The bulk of their fighting comes when they actually go forward in their base to base for combat.
Because in theory, they're still maybe 100 yards away, even though they're base to base contact. That whole combat resolution is not like a hand-to-hand melee going on along that line. It is they ran up into very effective musket range, which in this period we know we're talking mostly smooth bores, and you're talking 200 yards or less to be effective. They're there and they're blazing away at each other. At some point, do they move into hand-to-hand? Well, maybe, but usually what happens is what we've seen in the mechanics of the game, where that's taken into effect, where you make your roll, you do your comparison, and one unit says they had enough and they fall back, and maybe you get a breakthrough, but you're not crossing bayonets. Your morale fails at some point. At some point, the guy standing next to you says, I've had enough, and if he leaves, I'm not staying, so I'm leaving too.
If Eddie's gone, I'm out.
And then you get control of that when you got enough distance away from the enemy, and your officers and NCOs start having an effect to get you back on the line, but you're not up there in the front anymore. They've gotten you, they've reinstilled some morale and confidence in you, where you stopped moving backwards, at least for a piece of time.
Awesome. Well, it gives great narrative to it. So again, that might be one of those things where, like, I hear people use the word abstracted, and they think that sometimes that makes a rule set weak or justifies them not having rules. But in the scale that we're playing with ESR, not having the skirmishers modeled makes sense. Their modeling comes in the form of, like, if you just say that's part of like the fatigue, that makes a whole lot of sense to me. All right, cool. Well, with that in mind, I now have a firmer picture of how this works, so let's move on to some other stuff. We'll be back in a bit.
I'm on an attack order with one. I just couldn't get to you.
Right. This is the random musings that it's rambling too from my side. But so essentially, we just did the skirmish check, and I rolled good enough that I ended up taking 5 more fatigue on this formation and out minus 14. And we're saying, hey, yippee, that's great, because you only have to make that status check at the end if they got that during combat. So we're at a point where they have more fatigue than units. They're probably going to retreat, or if not rout at some point if they take more. And that's good, because they're on defend. However, that unit is on attack. And if once they push forward and they do some combat, then this unit is going to evaporate as well. They're super, super fragile. They can't skirmish, and their combat, they're on defense, so they can't even combat. I would have to convert them to an attack, but that would be a whole turn of waiting. So really, it's kind of like, what do we do with them? And again, this kind of comes back to, okay, cool. If they break, I could bring them back and bring back like 5 units, but then I'm bringing back 5 units against pretty much his entire first division of French and another division. We really have to start asking ourselves, do the Russians continue, or do the Russians concede because they're just that broken? But that's kind of where we are on that. It's like, holy cow, okay, so they're still on the field, but are they really on the field, or just a placeholder for bodies? We don't know. Anyway, more musings later on. All right, back with another musing here, random musing. There is an optional rule. Tom found this here. It's an optional rule for this would happen. We're not there yet, which is why we didn't really discuss it, but we just kind of found it now, talked about it now. during the movement segment.
It's in an order conversion phase.
I-
We're at combat phase, which we know we don't have anybody touching, but at the top of combat is an order conversion.
Can you do that during combat too, or is it only during the movement? Because that's where I found that conversion. It doesn't matter.
I mean, it's described in the movement area,
Right.
but it says formations may convert any order to a retreat in an order conversion. I don't.
It might not matter. Just that order
It doesn't
conversion.
matter where,
So
as long as
we
the
can do
order
it now
conversion
actually.
come up.
So yeah, since combat's coming up. So the optional rules. So this really good. So just in case, always read your side bubbles. That's our pro tip right there. There's some nice optional rules. You might not use all of them, but we found a few that actually back up different ideas that we've had. And this is one of them there. Is again, for those just tuning in right this second, this unit now has 14 fatigue on them. That formation is pretty much combat ineffective. Like they would be a speed bump for one more turn of action of some sort. But out of 16 turns, we're on like turn 7. They're not going to really hold out until 16 turns at this point. So yeah, we were thinking, well, yeah, why don't we convert them to a retreat? Now, if we're doing linked campaigns at some point, so this would be a consideration, one of those musings. If you're doing like linked campaigns where you might get some units back or your losses count, this would be a great opportunity to retreat, take some of these guys out, and then have them possibly available for your next linked scenario to this. Otherwise, if you're not, just leave them there, see what happens. But, you know, thoughts. But yeah, there is a rule for that. You can convert to a retreat if you need to. And this way, I could have them fall back behind the unit that just reformed, and then they would be in place to do skirmish and maybe afford an opportunity for them to reform. Now, again, I'm thinking long term, I would then be back to like having maybe a total of 5, 2 formations of 5 units each against this onslaught of French coming. How beneficial in the long run would that be? That might give us one or two more turns of gaming, maybe 3, depending on how timing works out. But ultimately, is it enough for the Russians to really turn this into a victory of some sort? I don't know. We'll be back. Puts us right on the edge. So this is what we decided to do. We've now hit the combat, and after looking at order conversions and things, we've decided that yeah, we can convert from their current defend to a retreat. They're going to fall back about 12 inches from the closest guy, his 900 yards, which puts us right here on the edge of the table. So we're just going to line them up. And just to save you spoiler alert, they are in the exact... Oh, no, it's not, because I got to roll 1 die 6. Okay, so when they convert to that retire, they're going to roll a die 6. We were doing some math based on if I rolled a 1 for the additional fatigue they suffer, then they would be in the exact same situation as the other Russian unit that broke. We could do all the exact same commands and stuff, which means I would drop 7, they would all pop back, and we'd be fine. However, I'm at 14 right now. I've got to roll a die 6 to see actually how much fatigue they accumulate, to see if that's, worth it. And that totally changes the dynamics of that. So we're now at 18 fatigue. Okay, so we'll do some math and we'll come back and discuss it. But essentially it's going to be the same thing. I'm going to have to bleed off a majority of this unit and inspire just about 4 units probably instead of 5. Yeah, okay, so we did some math. We figured this out. We're good. What we're going to do is pick up the units we decided to bleed off so that we could successfully bring them back into a fighting spirit. And we're keeping the Jaegers, so we're going to grab this guy. Now when I'm done, I'll have to put them back to 12 inches, but we're just bleeding off the losses here. And just because that's a 2nd battalion, we'll keep all the 1st there. And then we're going to lose this guy. And we're going to take him off. And we're going to take him off. And we're going to take this guy. And we're going to take this guy. And we're going to take this guy. Alright, and we did talk about this. So mathematically and game mechanics wise, if I drop 9 of those units, I could recover that entire 18 fatigue. If I did just 8, then I would have -2 fatigue, which is still some penalties on combat. They could still fight, but as we've seen, that still is horrible. It's horrible at this point. So even if I left that extra one on, I'd still have to roll to see if I could successfully deploy and get everybody back. But if I just go off of pure math to bring these on to get 100%, they're ready to fight, no fatigue, that leaves me with 3 units left out of the original 12. And against what we have left, and even if I 1 or 2 turns later, because it would take some coordination, I could merge them in somehow to this remaining Russian unit and then bring them up to a size of 8. But that's going to take a couple turns to make that happen. And in the meantime, he still has all of his French units. I think he lost nobody. You didn't lose a single unit, did you?
Not yet.
Not yet. So we thought, from a scenario standpoint, I think the Russians are done. I think they did very good. They put up a really strong fight. But, even narratively, I think if they just saw the bulk of their friends go, they're probably not really going to want to come back. So numerically, I think we've hit a point where we could continue playing just to push mechanics of the game. But from a realistic standpoint, I think the French, a few turns ago, clearly swept the Russians from the table. So that just kind of leaves maybe some parting shots, final opinions on that. I don't know, did you have any follow-up thoughts to that before we stick a fork in this one?
I think the fork is in it. It's done. And we will go from here, from Saltanovka to let me see. Let me look at this to see if I can pronounce it. Ostrovno. I think that's reasonable.
Sounds
next
reasonable.
battle is coming up is Ostrovno.
Yeah, sounds very reasonable. Now, there is actually at least one person in the comments who asks often what we would do differently. And the last game we played, there were some things I could do differently, mostly like in the deployment of artillery, things like that. In this game, we talked about this last week too, before when we wrapped up. What could I have done differently? So with the Russians, the thing, and I don't know how true this is, but I honestly feel like bad dice rolls is what hurt, because I was on this defended area. In my mind, I'm thinking, really, they actually deployed very well. They came onto the board, deployed in 2 really nice, beautiful lines of infantry divisions or formations, and the attackers came in and they were able to square off, and they had where they could fall back. But the dice rolls, even though they didn't take a lot of fatigue as far as some of the combat results, because they could just fall back on each other, but because they lost so many battles that splintered their lines, and then they failed their assessment checks, which means they were just adding fatigue, and they just accumulated a lot of fatigue because we didn't roll so well. I honestly don't think I could have deployed them much better. I really don't, because we came up to the woods and he came across. I don't know. I think it really just kind of boiled down to it was not the Russians' day. But I think they were deployed as good as I could really think of in the woods. I mean, obviously, if people have some better ideas, that'd be great. But I don't know if I would have done anything different with the Russians, because we had to defend that southern area. If we had had better results on, say, some of the combat or even some of the skirmishing, really it's the combats where we got pushed back and started to splinter, and some bad assessment rolls that really broke us. Had that been reversed and we had better rolls, we could have maybe pushed out of the woods and maybe actually pushed towards the villages. But that wasn't meant to be. So I really don't have an opinion on what I would have done differently with the Russians. But based on your your gameplay there, what would you have done different with the French?
I don't think I would have done anything different at
'Cause
this point,
they did
considering
good.
the outcome.
Yeah.
I think some of the differences from previous game are subtle and not necessarily apparent right away. One you called out early is you did a rush deployment and got that one fatigue.
Yeah.
The other
that's
thing
right.
that in other games we played we didn't have, the French did not have, but their formations here were enthusiastic. And so they got an additional one, and then you started off with a negative one. So now the difference is 2. So some of your rolling wasn't not, I don't know if it was necessarily your rolling, but the variables were changed just enough where maybe, you wouldn't have had as detrimental a result. But that extra -1 on your side for having the fatigue to start the combats, and the extra +1 that we hadn't encountered before on the French side has a cascade effect. And this is a historical replay, and so this is Davout's Corps, and historically, for those who know the period, you know Davout trains his corps to perhaps a higher standard than some of the other corps, and that's reflected in some of the modifiers that were available to the French this time that weren't available in our other pickup games. The other interesting thing, and this never came into play, the 57th Regiment of the Line, which is in Davout's Corps and had also a reputation of being a very highly trained unit within the French army at the time, was just coming up for an engagement. And again, that would have been more positive modifiers for French in the combat phase, and even if this didn't happen right up front as it did here, the best French unit hadn't yet engaged in combat. I believe historically at Saltkanova, the Russians did think that the best defense was an offense. They made the attack against the French, and perhaps, the Russian commander at the time was thinking, it's very constricted terrain, a lot of my firepower is sitting here with these artillery batteries, and if I don't give them the space to deploy, then they just sit in the back and wind up, going back to a retire, as we showed in this game. They never got to deploy. You've got big Russian batteries with 12 guns each, and each Russian formation had 3 batteries apiece. 4 of those batteries were 6-pounders, 2 of those batteries were 12-pounders. If they were brought up into the action and able to kind of fire in the artillery and skirmish phase, perhaps that would have given the French some pause before just steamrolling ahead and engaging in combat. But the French took the risk as well in making detachments to get flexible. So they started this game with one big unit of 15, one big formation of 15 units, but decided that flexibility wasn't there with that size of unit, so split into brigades of essentially 3 units of 5 apiece, with one of the units having an artillery battery that never really got to deploy because, well, hey, this line of this stream and all this dense terrain, stream and marsh, couldn't really get it over that stream and marsh effectively. And hey, the Russians were in the woods, so couldn't really deploy it effectively even if it got over the marsh. But took a risk, and could have easily, as Eddie pointed out, if some of those French units just lost a couple of those combats would have been fatigued and they would have been retreating.
Because they were much
Because they were
smaller.
much smaller.
Yeah. But you bring up a point that I did totally forget about. We talked about this before. Was that the rapid deployment that I did? Because I remember from last week, there were a couple rolls we made based on that one fatigue. I failed by one. And if I hadn't that fatigue, I wouldn't have suffered a status, loss or anything like that. I wouldn't have started my accumulation of fatigue. And then when we played here earlier, we kind of joked about that because you had to start to deploy the second division. And I was like, hey, you want to do that rapid deployment? And you kind of laughed and said, no. Yeah, because we saw firsthand that 1 point of fatigue actually does make a difference. And I agree. So based on remembering that would be the one thing I didn't do. But the thing is, in order to make an effective push, you're going to have to get out of your deployed, and you have to get from your ployed and get your people deployed. So even if I had not done that, let's say I didn't do the rapid deployment, and my dice rolls, because we were in dense, that's like a -5. Let's say I can only deploy 2, maybe 3 at a time. I don't think that would have been very effective to push across the river and up into, because you can't even deploy your artillery until you get everything out of the way. And I've got 12 people to go through, and if I'm deploying 2 or 3 people a turn, it's going to be several turns just to get people to move forward with. And I think that's why I went with the rapid deployment, because I wanted to get those people out front. Because see, when you finally started to deploy here, and you had out into the open, everything looked good, but you still only got 2.
Because I had
2.
moved up where I had to stop.
Because right here in the
within
dense,
900 yards got me just right there on the edge of the marsh and stream, and so.
But see, look at that. There's no way you would push across with just those guys, and they can't really push across until they have everybody deployed anyway. So it's like it would have taken. So based on that, let's say you could get 3. That's still like 4 turns to get everybody deployed before you could start to push forward into some kind of reasonable push. And I think that's why I went with that rapid for the Russians, is because I wanted to get them all deployed so I could push forward. That's really tough. Boy, that's some hard decisions on this map, for sure. See, if it was no problem getting people deployed, yeah, then I don't think I would have had to worry about a rapid deployment, wouldn't have accumulated the fatigue, and we would have just had people out and about, and we would have been fine. We would have pushed forward sooner. But this also brings up the point that we had, where you had mentioned actually the benefit of possibly a referee. Because we had discussed a little bit ahead of time, kind of based on the idea that the Russians had 2 choices. They could either defend here, which is what I chose, or they were going to try and push forward, which then would have altered what you chose to do. Right, that would have changed. So if we had a referee, then the referee could have in secret asked me, what I wanted to do, and then, Tom would have made a decision without knowing what I chose to do. So he kind of based what he was doing based on the fact that I said, well, I'll defend. So he kind of said, well, I guess I'll attack. So if we had a referee, maybe the game would have played a little bit differently too, because we might not have known exactly what we were going to do.
More units would have come into play on the other option. And, that's great. That's great to have a referee so you can kind of play those fog of war scenarios.
Right.
But with only 2 of us, we had to pick a objective. And setting this up, we went with kind of what the historical choice was for the Russian. It didn't have to be. They could have picked the clear the road to, whatever the name of the next Mogilev over here, and they would have had a whole other corps and cavalry behind this, in which case the French wouldn't have known that. The French would have had still these same start units, but they would have had more units behind them as well. The only downside of that, having played on this terrain, is a lot of the units the French were getting in the other victory conditions would have been a cavalry corps. And we already know that cavalry aren't going to work really well in dense terrain.
Right.
On another unit, there would have been a fair amount of Russian cavalry on, coming on as well. Again, Eddie would have had to make some decisions on, well, gee, cavalry ain't good in dense terrain, so I'm going to have to make an attack to give
push
my cavalry some room to come out if I'm ever going to use them out here somewhere.
Well, because we even had that discussion with your formation of 2 cavalry. What are they going to do? Like, what good are they in this scenario? And you pretty much said
they were guarding the town's house of ill repute from any incursions from non-authorized personnel.
That's very noble of them.
Yes, it was. They did sacrifice themselves.
I salute them.
They put themselves in a tight spot.
What up, yeah, but ching. I don't get it. Can you explain that to me?
No, I cannot.
Okay.
It's a G-rated.
We'll need pictures next time.
PG,
it's possibly PG. I might have to. You have to say at least one swear word to kick it up to a PG.
Sacre bleu.
Oh,
That's not really a swear word.
Yeah, that's something.
Savke put.
Well, that might be Russian.
That's the French equivalent of save your ass.
Oh.
We're not there yet.
All right. Well, there we go. We're now at PG, so I don't have to monetize this for children. All right. Yeah, I think we've covered quite a bit of possibilities, different ways we could have run this, some things that may have caused it to go the way it has. Have we learned from this? So if we're just going to continue the discussion for a moment in order to fill this out, because I know y'all like to watch hours of us just talking, what would you change in this scenario to maybe... No, wait, I had my question, I changed it. Here's the question I was going to ask you. I'm not going to edit this. What did you learn from this scenario?
What did I learn from this?
Yeah, what did you learn from this?
The value of a good defense is a good offense. No, but from a game mechanic perspective, each one of these gets me to learn, because a lot of what happens in the game is up at the command phase.
Yeah.
These different kind of terrain situations or formation setups get me to more closely examine what can I do in the command phase that allows me to do what I wanted to do. And case in point, well, I'll come back here again, we've talked about it several times, is taking that one big formation in the scenario design with 15 units, and I broke it up. Was there some risk involved in it? Yep, because I'm making more, I guess, they're more fragile or brittle if they're smaller, they can't absorb as much fatigue, but I didn't see a clear way to do what I wanted to do with such a large unit. I didn't want to risk going forward with everything.
I want to be on camera too.
So there it is. I am learning more about command phase decisions.
One of that socially distancing. Yeah, and but here's something, when you bring up the commanders, this was a discussion I had with myself when I was in the shower. The importance of the commanders. And we saw that when we started, there we go. When we started the very first part of the game last time, when we started to issue some of those orders, you had an A leader.
Yep, it's very effective.
And that guaranteed almost everything you did.
Almost.
That's like a +3, and then if he's there, it's, to his receiving guy was a B, that's a 5. And then if you had no penalties at all, that's guaranteed success. So that was huge. Now, not to say that the Bs weren't bad, because I would have to roll snake eyes to fail if there was no other penalties. But the thing with leadership is, you don't see it initially, because that first turn is usually, we just call that the setup turn. There was nothing happening except you're deciding what's my force objective, and then am I putting them, you were setting up for the rest of the game. So that's one thing that really emphasized for me here is the importance of leadership in the later phase of the game and how you use those leader actions, because we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to do with the Russians to try and bring them back, and none of that would be possible if I had poor leadership, or we didn't really think through kind of in the sequence of like do I rally first, or do I do like you did like a rally to somebody and then
I did a rally.
there was something
and
else
then
you
I
did,
decided
too.
that it wasn't worth committing that artillery battery.
That's right.
Because believe it or not, even with the exceptionally good leadership on the French side, I failed commit the battery roll the first time I tried it. And then by time the second opportunity came up, well, everybody was up on the ridge already, and there was no point in trying to get that battery any further than where it was kind of stuck.
So leadership, that one, I think that really makes this game a whole lot, because like what you said, you're at a different level of game when you play this one, because you're no longer concerned necessarily about not as much like the facings of folks, what formation they're in, what type of rifle they're using, the distance. Everybody is 6 inches for rifles. Everybody, because the skirmish is, all of that's different. Whereas like with the tactical level, like when we played Napoleon's battles, those are things to consider, because is that 7.5 inches versus a measurement of 6 inches, and then we could look and go, okay, well, I'm going to bring my Jaegers up because they shoot 7.5, and I know all of Eddie's line infantry only shoots 6 inches. So those were way different considerations. Here it feels like a lot of that is stripped away, and now you're just, like you said, concerned about how do I maneuver through the woods. Not necessarily what formation do I take. Is it best to have them in a march column, or but really it's how do I make all of those people fit into those areas that are nothing but woods and get them deployed. It's like it's just a totally different level of thinking.
And another thing that comes into play there, and I think these questions came up in the first session of the game, is the impacts on the dense or the rough terrain on what I want to do. Mm-hmm. And so because of I'm in dense terrain and I'm going to rush it and take the risk of, means you're going to get a fatigue on a rush. Mm-hmm. But how the mechanics of the game itself take some of that movement and the penalties into account, and it does it differently, and sometimes it's kind of subtle. So on a deployment and you're in dense terrain, well, you're still getting to move your 225 yards, right? But all the negatives associated with that came from the negatives when you're rolling on how many units you're going to get to deploy.
Right.
And if you didn't want some of those negatives, for example, if I didn't move a full 3/3 of my movement, say I only moved 1/3, well then I have slightly less negatives that I'm rolling, and I might get to deploy a few more units. So all of the terrain in the deploy area, the terrain is being accounted for in negative modifiers for what's going on. But then when you're actually committing units like artillery batteries, well, hey, now you're no longer taking these negative ploy or deploy, because your artillery batteries, we're going to move up to the reserve area when you finally get the last units out regardless. But then when you want to commit them out of the reserve, it's the terrain's being taken into consideration in a different way. Now you have to take into the account that you're in dense or rough terrain and you're only moving half. Or in some cases, if you're going to some of the optional rules, well, artillery doesn't move in dense terrain at all. So in that case, you would have had to consider, all right, they're in the reserve area, what, in march column lined up along this road, which means to actually get them out and deploy in any event, I'm going to have to push off into the clear. Now, we didn't use that optional rule. We did allow a deployment or a commit from reserve to half the move, which was okay. I mean, if you're really desperate enough, you'll manhandle those guns somewhere, but you won't do it very quickly.
Right. You get 'em.
And, in reality, you may not do it at all because, well, how far can you move them? You moved them 7.5 inches. That didn't even get them exactly where
Right.
you
And then
wanted
as soon as
them.
we did an assessment, they retreated anyway.
Right.
They retired.
And then they were,
So,
it takes into effect the terrain, in slightly different ways, but, I think it fairly accurately models the decisions you have to make. And then I think going into a scenario, if the dense terrain is dense enough where you can't move a battery, there's not a footpath or anything to move anything through, that would be in a scenario-specific rule.
Right.
We would have said, hey, Salt Canova is the terrain so dense you can't deploy the artillery. They'll sit in the reserve in a kind of a march column formation or a ployed whatever formation behind the infantry waves, but until they get some space, they're not coming out.
well, another takeaway I have, what I learned, is the devastating effects of fatigue. This is the first game we played where we had large units. Everything we've done up to this point has maybe been, I think, like maybe 6 or about 6.
Yeah, maybe 5, 6 units,
5, 6?
7 at most.
And it doesn't take much fatigue beyond that to break them or cause retreats. Whereas here, 15, and then, but it was like, but it takes a lot. You can take a lot more with these large units. But what I've learned is just how devastating that is. Just because you can take that much fatigue, do you really need to? Because again, like with the skirmishing, every point of fatigue is -3 from your skirmish result. So just because my unit can take and stand there and have 20 fatigue, that doesn't mean you actually want to do that with them. And so that fatigue and how you manage it, see, that's why I went ahead and did a retreat. I probably could have retreated even sooner, and actually I can see the benefit of a retreat even before then. Once those 15, 12 people, whatever they were, 12 people maybe hit about that 6 fatigue, I could have gone ahead and retreated them, and then maybe I would have only had to bleed off like 3 people to fix them.
3 battalions, yeah.
Instead
maybe.
of
3 units.
Instead of 9, So what I learned there is that's how you can make that game last 15 turns. It's not like you have to continually bash against your opponent. See, I'm still trying to unlearn from the little bit of tactics games I've done with other stuff, even beyond Napoleon's battles, but just in general, usually when you play, I think sometimes I still have that skirmish mentality where I want to bring them up to fight. But this is a game, because you're playing at, maybe that you pull the camera back, it's more a game of objectives. So just because I can fight you, is that necessarily what I need to do to win?
So one of the considerations is you brought 2 formations up which represented 2 full divisions, right? But you had no reserve.
Right.
You kept no reserve. So this may have been an opportunity for the Russians to say, I got this big unit of 12 guys, but is it in is that big 12 formation effective for me? Should I maybe make a reserve detachment?
Right.
Should I have, and I'll just use the Jaegers as an example. Maybe I could have peeled the Jaegers off and called that an advance guard, and they were their own formation, and then come up with them only, and you would have been getting those effective doctrine 3 for being light in the skirmish, and those were the buffer where the line unit stood behind as a separate formation, and may have been a slightly different outcome.
Well, yeah,
it might have been a way to kind of compartmentalize the fatigue more, or or bring up units that are more able to stand toe to toe with their French counterpart.
Yeah, because if you go back and then say, well, what would you have done earlier? yeah, now that you bring in some additional rules like that, like you did, you broke them down, that actually worked out for you really, really well. Because when we first looked at it, that was your concern, was it's only 5 people, that's not a whole lot of fatigue they can take. And we were looking at the Russians going, yeah, they can take 15 fatigue and they'll be great. But in actuality, that doesn't necessarily is a good thing that they can take the 15 fatigue. Because even if you take 2 or 3 fatigue, like you said, and now that we've discussed that option for the order conversions to a retreat, you could have just pulled back that one formation of 4 or 5 people, and you still would have had 10 people on the field that were still combat capable. Me, if I retreat, now I'm pulling back all 12 with X amount of fatigue across that whole thing. No flexibility whatsoever. So I could go back and revisit. I think you're right. Maybe I should have broke them down a little bit, pulled the Jaegers out, and kept, yeah, boy, it's almost like we got to play this again. But we're going to do the next game. But these are ideas to take forward to the next game that we play, because I don't know exactly the sizes we'll have. But those are thoughts we'll have is, yeah, maybe flexibility. But when you look at like World War II, they say a lot of times the Russians weren't very flexible. They had a very set doctrine. Were they that way in Napoleonics? Would they have broken down into smaller units, or would they have kept one large formation?
You would have to read the history of the Napoleonic Wars, and they lasted from essentially counting the wars of the French Revolution from the early 1790s all the way through 1815. So you're counting a 20-year span of time where things changed. Sometimes not rapidly. Some countries, armies maybe didn't absorb lessons as quickly as they could have or should have. But eventually, when you kind of fast forward the clock to 1812, 1813, 1814, by that time, every single major army is like based on the corps system, which the French pretty much had in place, I would think, by the late 1790s, and certainly by early Napoleonic period, the 1800s, 1805. 1805 at Austerlitz, and the Napoleon's armies all based on a corps system. The Russians and the Austrians who fought at Austerlitz were kind of still in a system where they had ad hoc columns, I believe is what they called them, and they made them up at the time. But the benefit of the corps system usually on the French side is those units were assigned to the corps. They trained with each other. They knew each other. Whereas if I was an Austrian or Russian formation or battalion, I might be assigned to this division, but that division's assigned with this other division today, and 2 weeks from now they're assigned with this division, and there's relationships that get built between leaders of those divisions that aren't there.
Right.
That are there on the French side in some respect. But in this action, I think, read the history of the battle, and that will give you your answer to say, were the Russians flexible at the point where they would make those decisions? I think they were. By 1812, if I recall the history of this particular battle, the Russians did have their Jaeger units make those initial attacks. In the mechanics of the game, was that called making a formation? Yeah, maybe it was making a detachment, and that's how they did it. They all didn't go forward. They didn't throw everything all in there at once.
Right.
I guess that's kind of like how you make a soup, or what's the other analogy where you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. So they would throw in, let's see, if I throw in these battalions, are they making any headway? Yeah, we got some success. Well, success feeds success, right? Throw in a few more battalions because we're pushing them. Or if it's going badly, then, well, we're pulling them back and then we're going to
something
reassess and decide what we're going to do next. Is that easier to do if you had made the kind of the Jaegers, because there were 4 battalions of Jaegers in
Yep.
each division. If you had 4 battalions here and 4 battalions on the other flank, and you sent them in and it was looking, this looks like I'm working or holding my own, all right, then my line infantry, in game terms, maybe they're on support. Okay, let's convert some of them to an attack now, because I'm starting to make a salient in the French lines. That gave you some flexibility to do that. If it wasn't going so well, what did I do? All the fatigue got concentrated on the Jaegers, and they fell back, or they took assessments, and then they took their status check.
Yeah.
And all those line units were not impacted by them taking that status. They're still there, ready to either hold the line here, or if they had to, move forward, convert to an attack, but depending on what you had them set up on.
So the more we discuss this, the more it's like, okay, so a bad leader blames his dice. A good leader would learn from that and go, you know what? I can see now the benefit of, well, one, retreat. Retreat is an option that I think is pretty valid. Because normally when I think of retreat in a lot of other games that we play, that means you are pretty much given up. Like, you're retreating. Okay, so here, yeah, you're retreating, you're falling back possibly off the table, but actually that leads into the opportunity for that rest and reform, or whatever the action's called.
Yep, rally and reform.
Rally and reform. So retreat here doesn't necessarily have to mean a bad thing. That's actually just a good way for you to bug out and decide what you're doing, kind of recalculate. So I think I could use retreat more, and that would make sense with the smaller units, because you could have done the exact same thing. If any one of those formations of like 5 people were having trouble, you could have easily just pulled one out, and then with these guys coming up, you could have just plugged a nice fresh unit right into that spot. And you're right, I didn't give myself that at all with the Russians, because I thought it would look more impressive as a show of force if we just marched everybody up there. Sure, it looked cool on the table, but now that I do look back, that was actually probably not a good idea, because one, by having them all together, there was a couple points where I had half of my line that couldn't fire.
Because they were outside of the parameters of,
They were just wasted. They could have been doing something else. But there was oftentimes a few times I said, wow, your 5 guys are really tearing up my 12. And because of that, I couldn't move all of those 12 people into any kind of, real combat cohesion to take on your 5 people. So just because I got 12 doesn't mean that's the best option. Your groups of 5 really pushed through. So I guess that is something I could learn from that. 1, don't blame the dice. 2, make better leadership decisions, and utilize some of those rules. And I guess that goes to your other point too. The more we play, the more we learn the rules, the more we learn that what we can do with those rules. Because everything we've done is just right there. There's nothing that we made up or said, hey, let's house rule and do it this way. In fact, it even makes me point out the optional rules. So far, there's been a few things that has come up and we said, wow, oh, but look, here's this optional rule that covers exactly what we were thinking, like the movement with the artillery. You mentioned the cavalry through the woods, how they would get fatigued and extra fatigue. That's not in the basic rules, but it would make sense that cavalry would have a hard time. So really, the rule set, I think, so far has given us all the tools necessary to maybe allow me at some point to fight more effectively, because the rules help Tim to lend to some of the tactics you could use. You just have to remember that tool is there. Oh yeah, I can break these guys down. Why would I do that? Well, you had a good example of that, and we just covered that. That gives you reserve elements and more flexibility. Yeah, I'm kind of running out of stuff. What do you think? Anything else you want to add to the wrap-up?
Well, I'll see you at Ostrovna.
Ostrovna.